Good afternoon, everybody. Kyle Brodick here from FullSkillsExamPrep.com. And today we have a really great lesson for you. So we're going to cover the Canadian Experience class over the next few hours. Now this one might seem like it's an easy topic because when you look in IRPA and the regulations, there's only about probably 10 sentences on this topic. So we're going to really thoroughly dig into the areas that could potentially be on your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. And by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of course, the topic in general, but especially how it can relate to your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now, you've probably gone through the previous lesson on express entry. So by understanding express entry, the procedures, and of course the CRS points, you're really halfway there to understanding how to handle the Canadian Experience class as a topic for your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. What we're going to do, of course, is really focus on those specific little tiny details of the CEC, as this will obviously help you towards conquering your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So when we take a look at the general procedures of the Canadian Experience class, it's almost the exact same as the Federal Skilled Trades Program and of course the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So remember that of course the first step for a person immigrating under the Canadian Experience class is to create that profile through express entry. Remember, with this express entry procedure, and of course going into that express entry pool of candidates, the person has to meet the minimum requirements of the skilled worker, skilled trade, or Canadian Experience class. And then the person can receive an ITA, as we'll see in step 3. So in that third step, remember we have CRS points and all that kind of stuff, of course, to think about, but in that third step, we're really looking at a person receiving an ITA through the Canadian Experience class. So that's what we're looking at with this question here. And of course, that final step of applying for permanent residency. Remember that an ITA doesn't guarantee PR, of course. If you are taking a look at those court cases at the bottom of the lesson here, on the website, you'll see that a lot of people get ITAs, and if they can't prove the knock experience as being relevant, then they don't receive their permanent residency. So we're going to really focus on this procedure, but especially in terms of the Canadian Experience class. Now here you have a lot of really great tools that you'll need to read through in order to fully understand this topic. So you have the CIC website, which is of course the best place to look. When you take a look at the regulations, you're going to think that this topic's pretty easy because it's really 10 sentences to cover the Canadian Experience class. We're going to see that it's actually not that simple. There's a lot of little tricky elements in there. So we'll explore this very thoroughly. Understanding the knock, of course, is essential. Just like I said before, if you're reading the court cases at the bottom here, you're going to see that a lot of those judicial reviews were because of people saying that they were a certain knock or who had a certain job title but didn't meet the knock descriptions. So you can see that that is definitely an important area to understand in terms of real-life immigration scenarios, and of course in terms of understanding scenarios in terms of your full skills exam. You have the Hire a Foreign Worker with Canadian Experience link over here. These ones are always good because you can really see the information from the perspective of a company that's hiring somebody. And of course, the Help Center. That's basically questions and answers. So it's a really great tool to help you understand this topic as well. So let's take a look at those general requirements of this stream. Now this is going to be a pretty thorough lesson, And again, it's going to bring you one step closer to passing the full skills exam. So let's take a look at those general requirements of the Canadian Experience class. So this is the most important one, and this is the one that is likely to play the largest role on your exam in this area of immigration. That is, of course, the work experience requirement. So under this class, there is 1 year needed of Canadian work experience at a NOC OAB level. We'll dig into this in way more detail in the next few slides here. So one of those other general requirements is the language requirement. And this one is pretty interesting because you have two options here. So we're going to explore this in the next slide as well. Just like in all of the other economic streams, the person cannot intend to live in Quebec. However, remember that the experience a person gains in Quebec can still count towards the Canadian Experience class as long as the person does not intend on living in Quebec. Now, when you're looking at the minimum requirements of this stream, there is no educational requirement for this. Also, the person does not have to meet the proof of funds requirements. But remember that in real life, you're not really going to look at the minimum requirements because a person needs to achieve a certain CRS score in order to receive permanent residency under this program. So remember, if a person has more qualifications or has the opportunity to get more qualifications, all of that adds a large amount of points to the CRS points, even though, of course, it's not one of the minimum requirements of the Canadian Experience class. And finally, even though this is called the Canadian Experience class, of course, a person can be outside of Canada when they apply for immigration under this stream. So that means that a person, let's say a person worked in Canada for a year, or maybe graduated a couple years ago and had a post-grad work permit for a year, and then went back to his or her country, they can still apply from that other country. All right, so let's take a look at the Canadian Experience class in terms of the language required for this. So you can see here we have the 4 language exams used for immigration, and you can see at the top we have CEC, NOC, OA. Now, the CEC, the Canadian Experience class, is really interesting in that it differentiates between people who have Canadian experience at a NOC OA level versus people who have Canadian experience at a NOC B level. So both of those people could qualify for this program, of course, but there's a slight difference in what the IRCC deems acceptable for the language requirements. So for people who worked in Canada and met those work requirements by having a NOC job, a NOC OA job, well, they need to meet a minimum of CLB 7 for their language proficiency. Now, I think we've talked about this quite a bit in the lessons, but a question that comes up quite a bit from the general public when they go see you as RCICs is they'll say, okay, but do I have to take the language exam? Because I lived in the States for a while, I work in English, or maybe the person's even an Australian person or a British person for English, right? And the answer is yes. There's no exceptions to this at all. Now with IELTS, with the Canadian Experience class, the minimum requirements are a CLB 7, which translates into a 6, a band 6 in everything for IELTS. For CELPIP, we can see that it's a 7 in everything because CELPIP's really easy to correlate with the CLB. TEF gets a little bit tricky. So TEF is all these numbers here, right? So everything's in your test day data booklet, of course. So be sure to use the material to get this. But you can see that writing and speaking are the same, really. So writing and speaking have to be somewhere between and including, of course, 310 to 348. And then the listening is 249 to 279, and the reading is 207 to 232. What if a person exceeds this? Perfect. It's great. It means that the person will obtain more CRS points, as we'll see in the express entry lesson. What if a person gets lower than this? Well, that's where we get into some trouble, because the person probably wouldn't qualify for the Canadian Experience class if they don't meet that language requirement. Okay, and finally we have the TCF. So that's the exam that was recently accepted for immigration purposes. And we can see the score there. So the score for listening and reading are pretty similar. They're just a couple scores off. So listening is 458 to 502 within that range, and reading is 453 to 498. Now, when we take a look at writing and speaking, we're looking at a score of 10 or 11 in each. All right, well, what if the person is at a NOC B level? Well, then the language requirements are a little bit lower. Now, remember, these are the minimum requirements to meet in order to qualify for the Canadian Experience class. If you've gone through the Express Entry lesson already, well, you know that the minimum of this isn't really the minimum sometimes, because a person with a CLB5, for example, and that NOC B experience, well, they might not have, or they probably wouldn't really have enough points to exceed the CRS cutoff score. But to go into that pool of candidates, this is what we're looking for. So we could see that with a CLB5, it's a lot lower, right? And remember, NOC B type of experience, you have it, of course, in your booklet, but generally speaking, you should have an idea about what NOC B experience is, right? The classic jobs for that include, of course, electricians, plumbers, trades work in general, and those types of jobs, really. So the requirements for IELTS are a 5 in everything except for reading. So reading's a little bit lower at a 4. Okay, for CELPIP, it's easy. It's just 5 in everything. For TEF, we've got this array of numbers again, where writing and speaking follow the same idea with a 226 to 270. Listening is a 181 to 216, and reading is a 151 to 180. And then le TCF is at a 6 for writing and speaking, and for listening at a 369 to 397. Reading would be a 375 to 405. So when we began this lesson, I told you that there aren't really that many requirements under the Canadian Experience class. But that doesn't mean it's an easy topic. There are quite a few little tricky areas that you're going to have to think about in terms of scenarios that might be on your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So one of those little tricky areas has to do with a person who has 2 jobs. So let's say a person was in Canada, maybe he came as a student or something like that and got let's say a 3-year post-grad work permit and worked for some time in a NOC OA position and also for some time in a NOC B position. So if he did, let's say, a year and a half in a NOC OA position and a year in a NOC B position. Now the question, of course, is which CLB level would he need? And Regulation 87.1 covers this. So if the person worked more in the NOC OA position, which the scenario I just gave you has that, of course, and he would need a CLB 7. But if a person worked more in a NOC B position, then the person would need a CLB 5. All right, so that's a little tricky area that you would want to think about, of course, when you're thinking of language exams and how they relate to the Canadian Experience class. Now let's dig into the experience requirements. So this aspect of the Canadian Experience class is the most important one to be able to fully understand in terms of questions that might come up on your full skills exam. So by the end of this little section, you're going to have a way better understanding of experience as it relates to people who want to apply for permanent residency under the Canadian Experience class. And of course, we have sample questions for you after. So those are going to help you to tie this all together into a question format as well. Now, if you remember from some of the previous lessons, it's really important when you are looking at experience to think of it in two ways. So first, we have to think of the time that a person spends working, and of course we have to think of the role that they are in. You need both of those in order to qualify for any economic immigration stream, and it's really important that both aspects of experience are met. Now, when we look at time with regard to the Canadian experience class, it's a little bit different from some of the other economic immigration streams, and we're going to see why right now. Now, part of completely understanding those experience requirements for the CEC is to have a very good understanding of the time requirements within that experience. So remember that in general, one of those general requirements is that the person has to have 1 year of Canadian NOC OAB work experience, but that experience has to be within the last 3 years before applying. So if a person doesn't have that 1 year yet, and they think it's going to take some time to process the application and that kind of thing, that doesn't work, of course. The person has to have that 1 year within the last 3 years of applying. Remember that work is not 5 hours a week, it's a lot of hours. So you'd have full-time at 30 hours a week for 12 months, which would equal 1 year of full-time work at 1,560 hours, but that's okay to have part-time on that as well. Just like anything else, if the person works 60 hours a week, it wouldn't count for time, or the overall time that's missing. So let's say somebody works for 6 months at 60 hours a week. That would not equal 1 year of Canadian work experience. All right, so remember that, of course, if a person is working in Canada as an illegal or unlicensed plumber or mechanic or something like that, of course that work experience would not count because he's working illegally. And just like the Federal Skilled Trades program, in the Canadian experience class, the work experience doesn't have to have been continuous. So the person could have done 3 months of NOC B work somewhere, then maybe 3 months of NOC C work in another place, and then NOC B, and alternating. And as soon as that person reaches 1 year of NOC B work experience, as long as they meet the other requirements, then they might qualify for the Canadian experience class. And of course, if that person worked in Canada, which in this case it has to have been completed, his or her work has to have been authorized. So he has to have been authorized to work in Canada. So somebody working illegally or anything like that, that would not count. We're going to explore that concept thoroughly in the next slide. And just a little tiny detail here, if a person worked in Quebec, that's not a problem at all. However, the person cannot intend to live in Quebec. So we took a look at what type of work experience counts under the Canadian experience class. Now let's dig a bit deeper and take a look at what type of Canadian work experience does not count in this. And we're going to reiterate some of those points that we talked about already. So as we mentioned before, work that was conducted without authorization would not count towards this. Now, examples of that can be work that was conducted illegally in Canada. So if somebody overstayed their visa and was working, or somebody sort of snuck in and was working illegally, that cannot count for work experience under the Canadian experience class. if a person worked while they were waiting on the results of a refugee claim, that's the same thing. So they would maybe have a work permit, but they're not authorized to count that work experience towards the Canadian experience class. When people come to Canada and work while they are on a study permit, that does not count either towards the Canadian experience class. So if somebody comes and does a 2-year master's degree and has a part-time job, working 20 hours a week as a NOC OAB in some type of position, that work experience cannot count towards the Canadian experience class. Maybe during the holidays, the person worked full-time. That work again does not count because the person was on a study permit. Time spent in internships and co-ops and that type of thing as well, that time spent working would not count towards the CEC. And of course, self-employed work does not count towards this either. And I would assume it's because it's a little bit difficult to verify the hours on that. And of course, work performed at a NOC C or D level does not count towards the Canadian experience class. Okay, so we looked at time with regard to experience for people applying under the Canadian experience class or being invited to apply under the Canadian experience class. Now let's move on to those role requirements. We touched upon this quite a bit in the previous slides, just because they're so interrelated. But let's really help clarify those role requirements with regard to the Canadian experience class. Now, if you tuned in for the Federal Skilled Trades lesson, you saw that we analyzed the NOC requirements with regard to a person's experience. The Canadian experience class follows the same guidelines for that. So you can see this, of course, in Regulation 87.1. Remember that the person needs to have had or needs to have completed 1 year of NOC OAB work experience in Canada. And when you look at that work experience, remember that's not just the title of the person's job. They have to have performed the actions listed in the lead statement for the occupation on the NOC. And of course, a substantial number of the main duties for that position. Now, to conclude this lesson, something that's really going to help you to understand those NOC requirements is to read through some court cases that have to do with exactly this and exactly in the context of the Canadian experience class. So these are all linked for you, and these are going to really help you to be able to understand this information about law, of course, but in the context of real human scenarios. So you can see in this one with Mefuz, this person applied under the CEC, but the work that he or she didn't match the NOC requirements. This one is a great one as well, Kai versus Canada. And with this one, it's interesting because it shows you exactly what's required under the substantial number of main duties requirement. And finally, Fang versus Canada talks about what people need at an appropriate NOC level in terms of experience in order to qualify for the Canadian experience class. So this is going to be a little bit of a different way for you to really understand how important NOC is, of course, in the Canadian experience class, and I hope that this really clarified, first of all, how important it is to thoroughly understand experience in the Canadian experience class, and of course, how to see these in the context of potential questions. All right, so a very big thank you for tuning in. Now you're going to have a lot of fun because you have 3 sample questions ready for you. Remember that these sample questions are really important to do because it's going to help you take all of the information we talked about today and put it in the context of scenarios and potential questions that you might see on your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. All right, so thanks again for tuning in, and we'll talk soon when you start your exam simulation questions.